How are you guys all feeling? It's been one of those days, huh? Not the best weather, but I want to tell you, I want to thank you guys so much for coming out and paying attention to what I've come to learn is very, very important issue for the safety of many people, of our rail workers, of children going to schools near rail track, the railroads where the freight cars are transporting these hazardous substances. I don't want to talk too much because I really want you to listen to our speakers, but I do want to say thank you to our sponsors. Thank you so much, Trinity United Church of Christ, for having us here. Thank you very much. Railroad Workers United. Can you guys stand up, please? Can we please give these guys a hand? These are the guys that are keeping us safe despite very difficult working conditions. God bless you guys. League of Women Voters. We have some sponsors that are set up there. So, maybe in between speakers or on your way out, if you haven't already been there, maybe grab some of their materials. There's Citizen Advocacy Center. I'd like to introduce them to all of you. They are a group of community lawyers who, when I found out what was going on in my backyard, and when I approached my mayor and had a very unpleasant experience, and they were my first line of defense. They've never asked me for a dime. I am now a lifelong donor, but they work on grants, and they are a free legal service available to community members. So please, if you get a chance, get some of their literature. I want to thank, League of Women Voters, Arlington Heights, Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action, thank you. Chicagoland Oil by Rail, Frack Free Illinois, and Chicago Greens. They've sent out information to thousands of people. I know there's still a lot of people that don't really understand this issue, but again, thank you so much for coming out here. We also have some political support with us. I'm not sure if they're here yet, but if they're not here yet, they said they'd be coming. We have Greg Klaus, who is a staffer for Brad Schneider, so he has sent somebody here as a representative, and he has taken some interest in this issue. Is he here, Greg? Adam Broad was coming. He's a congressional candidate who also has an interest in this issue. Julie Simpson, she is my favorite county board member because she is my county board member. She said she was going to try to make it here today. CLC trustee Matt Stanton, right here, who's also running for state's attorney. Is there anybody else here I missed? Could you please stand up? Please stand up. Say hi. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. You guys, I'm sorry? Thank you, Mayor Mary Rosenthal. Thank you so much for being here. My head is still spinning after having listened to our speakers. They are a wealth of information. So the first speaker I'm going to introduce to you is Justin Mikulka. When I first learned what was going on in my backyard, there was very little information available. These three people, these are some of the first voices that I heard. I'm still in disbelief. I've got the three of you together in one room. So Justin Mikulka, he is an investigative journalist for the independent news and research organization DeSmog, and author of the book Bomb Trains: How Industry Greed and Regulatory Failure Put the Public at Risk. For the past 5 years, Justin has reported on the growing threat of explosive oil and ethanol trains in North America. Mikulka holds a degree in environmental engineering from Cornell University. He currently lives in Trumansburg, New York. So please come join us.
One, two. Thanks everyone for coming out. It's great to see you all here. And as Jerry mentioned, it's going to be a lot of great information. Jim and Bruce, I'm very excited to hear them speak. as Jerry mentioned, I've been covering this issue for the last 6 years, basically. I started looking into this because I lived in Albany, New York, which became the largest oil distribution hub on the East Coast. That was all Bakken oil coming by rail. And so started to ask questions about how that could happen. And once trains started blowing up, first with Lac-Me, then 4 other trains in the next 6 months. The cover of the book, some people ask me, is that a real photo? Yes. And the other question is, where's the train? The trains are very small at the bottom, just to give you the scale of the explosions when one of these tanks explodes. So that was in Castleton, North Dakota in January of 2014, I believe. Oh. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the book tonight. I'm going to cover some more relevant issues, but unfortunately, I'd like to be standing here saying that we've really addressed all the issues that we've known about over the last 6 years since Lac-Me, that we've used the known science, that regulators, politicians, corporations made these trains safe, which is possible to do. But that's not what the book is about, and that's not what we're here to talk about. Unfortunately, in my opinion, I believe the risks are as great or greater than they were in 2013. This is a quote, I think that this is important about this whole discussion because the corporations refuse to do what needs to be done. This is a quote from Sarah Feinberg, who was the administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration at the end of the Obama administration. And the science is there, the data is there, their argument is, despite the data, they don't want to spend the money on it. So this was the top official at the FRA saying, we know what to do, they won't spend the money on it. The other thing is that's important when you hear someone like that, this is the top regulator for the railroad industry, she can't make them spend the money on it. And that's one of the critical problems with our regulatory system. So, some points I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about some of the current issues because there are several that are relevant and in the news right now. Go over some of the major risks that are still on the rails with oil and ethanol. And then speak also about what we can do as individuals when we understand how the regulatory system works, or in this case, does not work, but what we can do to try to make some positive change. One of the things, I think a lot of people think that oil by rail isn't as big an issue because there aren't as many trains on the tracks these days. You can see that in 2014 and 15, when a lot of the accidents were happening, that was the big boom in the Bakken oil, and that was the height of the volume of oil moving by rail in the U.S. But it went down in 2017. But we are back up to levels of the Lac-Me and other major accidents. So there's a lot of oil moving on the rail now. So the risk is still very real. There are 2 components to the oil that's coming through cities and areas like Chicago. This is U.S. oil by rail volume. So this is mostly Bakken, but there is also oil moving out of the Permian in Texas now. And there's growing movements. They want to build a new rail track in Utah to move fracked oil to connect it to the national rail system. So that's one project that's going to increase oil by rail. And they're also exporting a lot of this fracked oil now, and it's going to the Gulf Coast. And so there's actually a community right now in Louisiana fighting a new oil project to bring oil by rail to put it on boats and ship it to other countries. But another major risk these days, you can see in 2013, there wasn't much Canadian oil coming through America. Now you can see in 2019, there's been a huge spike. So this is a big issue. The Canadian tar sands are coming through your community, a lot of it's going to the Gulf Coast, but there's a lot of Canadian oil moving through the U.S. This is a quote from this week from a major investor in Canada saying there's big motivation to increase oil by rail use. It's underused. So where the volumes that we're at are significant now, but Canada is looking to move a lot more oil by rail, and that's all It's all coming to the U.S. to be exported or to refineries. So this issue is only going to, the risk is only going to increase. So some of the current issues. Illinois actually is the battleground for one of the issues, which is two-person crews. Another state battleground right now is Washington State. They're fighting over oil volatility limits. Then I'm also going to talk about LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, which is a huge new threat coming soon to the railroads. Oops. So I really like this headline, defying federal agency, Illinois governor signs bill requiring two-person crews on freight trains. We need to defy the federal agencies because they're not doing their job. And, but this is what's happening in Illinois right now. The federal regulations that were proposed during the Obama administration to require two-person crews on oil trains and on freight trains have been withdrawn by the, in May of this year by the current FRA. Oops. And this is while this issue is important and a safety issue of the two-person crews, when the current FRA withdrew this proposed regulation, their explanation it's the Federal Railroad Administration, so it's the main regulatory oversight agency. Sorry about that. When the Federal Railroad Administration withdrew the regulation for two-person crews, it wasn't just, they're within that explanation, they made two statements that were very troubling about the current regulatory environment. The FRA there is the Federal Railroad Administration. In their announcement, one of the things they said was the intent of withdrawing this regulation was not only that they didn't think it was valid, but they also, what's in red here, that they thought that it would have a preemptive effect. And so what that means is they're saying when someone like the state of Illinois says we want to have a regulation in our state for two-person crews, they're now saying you as a state no longer have the right to do that. You cannot regulate and protect the public in your state. The federal government can preempt that and override that. And there are 10 or 12 states that have regulations like the one in Illinois, and this is going to be a big legal battle about does a state have the right to protect its public, or can the federal regulatory agencies overrule them? But the more troubling part, in my opinion, was on page 21 of the 25-page explanation of why they're withdrawing this regulation. They said the DOT, which is the Department of Transportation, which is the oversight body over the Federal Railroad Administration, their approach to achieving safety now is to remove unnecessary barriers and issuing voluntary guidance rather than regulations. So this is announcing that the official policy now is to allow the railroads to self-regulate and to volunteer to improve safety in any way. This is very troubling because this doesn't apply only to the two-person crew. This now applies to, and the Federal Railroad Administration as a whole now. There have not been any new safety regulations since in the Trump administration, and there have been several that have been removed. And that's the policy now. The official policy is to let the railroads to volunteer to improve. And history will show that, or has shown, they will never do that. So another states' right issue, which is very important, and in my book, one of the issues that I focus on a lot is the volatility of the oil, the Bakken oil, and also the Canadian tar sands oil. The reason these are called bomb trains is because of the oil. That's where's the real danger for it to ignite and explode. And so there are ways to address that and make the oil safe to move and not make it flammable and explosive. And that is to reduce the volatility. So Washington State has now passed a regulation saying that you have to limit the volatility of the oil coming into the state by rail to 9 pounds per square inch, which is the limit that is also used when oil is put into pipelines. So the oil industry is very familiar with that. They know how to do it. They just choose not to do it when they put it in the rail cars. And so what North Dakota and Montana, where this oil is being produced, they are suing Washington State, saying you're not allowed to do that as a state. And this is going to get back into that same issue of, does a state have the right to protect its citizens, or is that going to be left up to Washington, D.C. regulators? And this, again, like the two-person crew rule, this is happening right now. The lawsuits haven't been filed yet. There will be lawsuits. But this is the pressure being put on the people in Washington State. This is something the oil industry loves to do. Phillips 66 is a major refiner there. They're saying because of this Washington State regulation, we're not able to bring in as much oil as we want. It's hurting the economy. It's hurting our profits. So there's going to be pressure. There's a lot of pressure on Washington State. The governor there, Governor Inslee, has said they're going to fight it. So this, again, will be another lawsuit. And this is very important because the volatility of the oil is the major risk factor with these trains, and it definitely should be limited. So, as I said, these are going to be important legal battles about states' rights. If we lose in the courts, and states no longer have the right to have any say over what's coming through in the trains, and how many crew members and all of these safety issues, it's going to be left up to the regulators in Washington, D.C. And right now, the top regulatory positions in the agencies that can make new regulations are staffed by a former rail company CEO and a former rail company, another high-level executive. So the rail companies are essentially in the top regulatory positions. So that's why these legal battles are so important, because if we're going to allow the top regulators in D.C. to be former executives and announce that the policy is to just let the rail industry to volunteer to improve safety, we're going to have a lot more accidents. This is an issue. LNG, which I mentioned, is liquefied natural gas, which is there's a huge amount of natural gas being produced right now in America via fracking, and they're trying to export it because there's far more than can be used in the United States. And so what they do is they supercool that to make it liquid, so it's brought to a temperature of around minus 300 degrees, and one of the ways they want to transport that now is by rail. Earlier this year, President Trump issued an executive order saying he wants this to be allowed by early 2020, which is not the normal way regulations are made, but that's what's proceeding. There's a special permit right now that's in process to allow one rail company to do this, but what they're proposing in that special permit, and which would be what will be allowed going forward, is unit trains, so trains of 100 cars or more long, of tanks of liquefied natural gas. They're not proposing any new safety regulations, no speed limits or train length limits. This, I think, is a huge issue because there is so much natural gas. This will be coming through your communities because it will be going all over the country. They're trying to export it. This is an issue I personally think is a huge safety issue. And needs to be addressed, and the way it's progressing right now with the current regulatory system is essentially they're just saying, they're just letting the railroads go ahead, and this could be coming through your communities in early next year, which a huge risk. I think we need to educate our politicians and anyone else about what's happening here because a lot of people aren't aware of this. So now I just want to talk about some of the ongoing risks because of the regulatory failure, things we know that are real risks that haven't been addressed with oil trains and ethanol. As I mentioned already, I think that the main issue here is that this oil is volatile. The reason these trains are called bomb trains is that the oil comes out of the ground after it's been fracked in places like North Dakota with a lot of natural gas liquids in it. So that's things like butane and propane. These liquids can be removed by a process known as stabilization. The industry refuses to do it. And this next quote here, after the accident, when the disaster happened in Lac-Me, there were several articles written, and they had executives from the oil companies saying, we don't know what happened there, but crude oil doesn't explode like that. And so these were experts about oil saying, something happened there, it wasn't crude oil. There were theories that there could have been propane tanks that the trains crashed into that caused the explosions to start. The reality was that crude oil in those coming from the Bakken region that was in the Lac-Me disaster had propane in it, and it had butane in it. And that's the reason, that is what caused that disaster. The industry knows this, they admit it, but they say it's more valuable if it has propane and butane in it. They can make more, they can sell it for more money to refineries if they keep those dangerous natural gas liquids in it. So it's another simple case of them just choosing profit over safety, and they're open about the fact that that's what's going on. This is what's happening in Washington State right now, where they're trying to limit by removing the natural gas liquids, you lower the volatility, and so that's what the law in Washington State is trying to attempt to do. I think it's a very important, an important fight. I think this is the most important issue when it comes to oil by rail safety. If you stabilize this oil, you would take out the risk of these explosions, and you would get back to something where we could say crude oil doesn't explode like that, because when you take out the natural gas liquids, you're left with crude oil. So as I mentioned, North Dakota is fighting the regulation in Washington State. There was a new study. It took 5 years for the federal government to get a study about Bakken oil, which was a long process, but it was a single study done where they're now claiming that Bakken oil is no different from other oil. It's not more volatile, so it shouldn't be regulated any differently. This is a quote from, I believe, last week from the Attorney General of North Dakota, saying the net result is Bakken oil is no different than any other kind of oil with respect to volatility. That's a lie. That's the science, that's purely, he may not understand the science because he's an Attorney General, not a scientist, but that's a complete lie, but that's the argument the industry is making with a report generated by our federal government. Canadian oil, as I mentioned, this is going to become a much bigger problem because a lot more of it is coming our way. The tar sands is bitumen, is what the actual name of tar sands. To ship it in rail tank cars, they have to dilute it to make it more liquid. They dilute it with condensate, which is highly volatile hydrocarbon, so essentially making it like Bakken oil. So there was a real risk with this diluted bitumen in rail cars to perform in accidents very similar to Bakken oil. So this was one of the accidents. This is a tar sands train. It burned for, I believe, 3 days. I don't know whether you can really see it. That's a river that those are all in. So the oil went directly into a river. But so this is, the same risks are there with the tar sands, the diluted bitumen trains. Another factor, since the new regulations came out in 2015, there's been a lot of talk about how they're starting to get the new DOT 117 tank cars and claiming that those are safe. There was an article in the New York Times recently, in the last couple of months, that said, one of the safety regulations that one of the things that has improved safety is the new tank cars. The New York Times made a big error by saying, but we don't know how they perform in accidents because there haven't been any. There have been 3. All of them have been major derailments. Two of them were oil trains, one in Canada and one in Iowa. And one was an ethanol train in Texas in April of this year that exploded or caused a big fire. It burned a stable, it killed some horses, they had to evacuate the local neighborhood. All of these involved major spills. So we're in a situation where they went through a several-year process to say we need safer tank cars. Everyone agreed that the DOT 111s that were involved in Lac-Me that were never designed to move crude oil weren't adequate. So what they came up with these DOT 117s, we've had 3 accidents. They failed just like the DOT's 111s in all of them. So the tank cars that are moving the oil now have newer paint jobs, but still are inadequate for moving oil. This is the one accident in Iowa. You can see it spilled 230,000 gallons, went into a river, and then this was the industry response. Here we have tank cars, clearly oil all through that water, but the energy now is basically the American Petroleum Institute, and they were trying to put a positive spin on it, saying workers have contained nearly half of the crude oil. That still means there was 150,000 or so gallons of oil in the river. Another issue that I focus on a lot in the book and is a major safety issue is the oil trains and other freight trains are working with air brakes. That's technology that was essentially invented in the 1860s. And so I personally, when the regulations came out in 2015, they required oil trains to have these modern brakes called electronically controlled pneumatic brakes, or ECP. Those regulations were announced in May of 2015. In June of 2015, I was in Washington, D.C. at the annual EIA conference, which is probably 500 people, executives from a lot of companies from the various energy industry. And at the time, oil by rail was a big deal. The new regulations had just come out, and the CEO of BNSF was there. They were the company at the time moving the most oil by rail. So at that conference, in front of the whole crowd, the CEO was asked what he thought of the new regulations, and he said, "I thought they're pretty good. We like the tank cars. We don't like the braking regulation, and we're going to have to do something about that." At the time, I didn't understand how these things worked, so I thought that was kind of odd, because we had just gone through a several-year process to get new regulations. And here was a CEO saying, we're going to get rid of that. They did. The Federal Railroad Administration in 2017 repealed that. It was a long, convoluted process of how that happened. But essentially they used Congress to study the issue and then repeal that. So the one real safety regulation that was put in place, the corporations were very easily able to get it undone. Another issue that is a real issue, if you see some of these trains, they're very long. They can be a mile long or longer. Longer trains are more likely to derail. Oil and ethanol trains are often the longest trains. A lot of the accidents have trains that are 100 cars or longer. There are no regulations for train length. There are no proposed regulations for train length. And also troubling is no regulations have been proposed for these new LNG trains. So those also can be as long as the industry wants. And the thing about train length is a longer train makes more money. So the rail companies they want the longest trains they can get down the tracks. So, the process, I've watched this over the past 6 years. It's just, in my opinion, complete regulatory failure. The regulators are not the ones calling the shots and making the regulations. I mean, that quote at the beginning with Sarah Feinberg saying the rail companies know what they need to do, they just don't want to spend the money. You would think she, as the head of the Federal Railroad Administration, could make them spend that money. She couldn't. Lobbyists from the American Petroleum Institute and the rail lobbyists are involved in every step of the negotiations. And then there's another step. So when the regulations have been finalized by the regulators, they go to an office in the White House where they are finalized, and the final regulations are put forth. That process involves meetings, private meetings with all of the head of the rail companies, the oil companies. So the corporations get to go in and talk to the people making the final decision in private, and that is how the regulations are finalized. It's a very broken process. And then, as I mentioned with the modern brakes, even when we get through and get a real regulation that works, Congress can then reverse that. This is just an article we wrote about how, and things are bad in the current administration, where they've moved to almost a deregulatory environment. Things were bad in the prior administration with the Obama administration. This isn't new to the Trump administration. So, the one positive part in my book, I believe, is about how activists have been successful in, the only thing that has made this safe in any way is activists keeping more oil trains off the tracks. This is from a book called Death Rode the Rails, and this is a quote: "The rail industry has a long history of putting profit over safety, but most carriers did little until the disasters of 1886 sparked public outcries." So activism has been the only thing keeping us safe in any way for over 100 years. Activism has worked. There have been a string of successes of local communities blocking new oil by rail infrastructure, most of them on the West Coast, but it's happened in Baltimore on the East Coast. Albany, New York has blocked some new tar sands infrastructure. So this has been the real way to, by blocking the new infrastructure, the companies do not have, that's essentially keeping more rail volume that would be coming through communities like yours that would have been going to those new facilities. They haven't been able to do that. It's been a real success story. To end on a somewhat positive note, obviously the real, the long-term solution to this is keeping that oil in the ground. But these are some recent stories that I thought were somewhat positive. The tar sands oil is coming from Alberta in Canada. And right now, the hot growth industry there is solar power. It is not tar sands. I think that is a promising sign. And on a similar note, BNSF, the biggest oil by rail carrier, is owned by Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world. And clearly, he doesn't care about the climate or the environment because he's happy to make money off of oil trains. Just in the past week or two, he also owns a major utility in the Midwest. And what they are doing, they just announced that they're going to close down all of their coal production in the near future, in the next 5 years or so, but they're not going to replace it with natural gas, which is what the oil and gas industry is pushing for. They're going straight to renewables plus battery storage. And so this is someone who does not care about the climate or the environment, purely cares about making money. And so at this point, in America, it is cheaper to go to solar and wind and storage. So this is something I write about a lot now, but I wanted to end on a positive note, the fact that the guy making the most money off of oil trains has decided to go with renewables. And that's my presentation. Bruce is up next.
One of the things that Justin does a wonderful job of in his book is when I was first trying to wrap my head around this issue, trying to figure out who was saying what and what the motive was behind it. And his book really does a wonderful job of fishing that out, and it makes the conflict of interest after conflict of interest after conflict of interest very clear, and how there's just a breakdown in accountability. It's a huge issue, and we're very dependent on fossil fuels in just our day-to-day living. And the thought of, well, what do we do? Just not have it anymore? That is very difficult for many people to wrap their head around. But that, the more I think about this, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, we need some sort of a long-term phase-out plan. But in the meantime, where we can really start digging in is doing things to make it safer, and to keep, like I said, I'm an educator, so what has driven me to not give up on this issue is, every day I've got 2 schools in the district that I work at where children are at risk and their parents don't know it. That's wrong. That's morally wrong. I mean, parents have a right to make a decision regarding the safety of their child, and they can't do that if they don't know. So, number one, raising public awareness. And then, again, there's no easy solution. What do you do? Get rid of the railroad? Well, probably not. Well, then what do you do? Move the school? Well, now there's money. But at the very least, let people know so that if they do choose to move, then they choose to move. They have a right to make that choice. And maybe there can be some other solutions that are developed when people start putting their heads together, but that'll never happen if we don't start looking into this. So, thank you, Justin. Thank you for the work that you've done, and that book has helped me immensely. I highly recommend it. The next speaker we have is Bruce Campbell. He is former executive director of the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, one of Canada's leading independent think tanks, author of Lac-Me rail disaster, Public Betrayal, Justice Denied. Campbell also wrote 3 major reports and a number of media commentaries on the Lac-Me rail disaster, in which he chronicles the history of regulatory and managerial failure that made the Lac-Me wreck invisible, and which drives the increasingly risky industry that hasn't learned any of the lessons revealed there. So please come on up, Bruce.
Put this down and use it. So,
Is it going to work?
With this.
Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. So, if this fails or leaves where it falls off, then I'll revert to Plan B and use the same mic that Justin was using. So. Nice to see you all. It's nice to be here. I was here, I guess, in the spring, or late winter. So I'm back in Chicago. It's nice to be out of Canada. We're in the last stages of a real hardly fought election. It's nice to be in the U.S. where things are so stable and boring, and so just to dip out for a few days. So thank you to the sponsors for enabling this, and for Jerry, who's done an amazing job to pull it all together. I bring greetings from my friends in Lac-Me. I'm definitely not an official spokesperson, but I've been this issue has involved me for over 6 years now. It's over 6 years since it happened. This book came out last fall, and the French edition is coming out in about a week. So I'm really excited about that. Lac-Me is a small community of about 6,000, very remote in Quebec, near the main border. Most of the people are French speaking, and most of the people speak little or no English. So to make it accessible to them is really, I was really happy to see it happen. And I am doing the first book launch on the 19th of October in the town itself. So that will be a very emotional time. My goal in writing the book, Leonard Cohen said, what he said, there's a crack in everything, that's where the light gets in. Well, that's what I've tried to do. That's one of the things I've tried to do was find the cracks and shine the light on what happened, why it happened, and who is responsible. It's my effort. It's not a substitute for a public inquiry, a judicial inquiry, which my friends in the coalition in Lac-Me are really pushing for, and lots of people are pushing for. After 6 years, the government, either the last government or the current government, refused to hold an independent judicial inquiry. They relied on the Transportation Safety Board, which is the Canadian equivalent of the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board. And so it's one of the things that they're really putting a lot of pressure. Lac-Me is a cautionary tale. As Justin said, it's about corporate negligence and regulatory failure. And it was the violent consequence of a decades-long systematic removal of safety precautions through a series of mutually reinforcing policies, deregulation, privatization. CN used to be a publicly owned corporation, and austerity. And those have reinforced each other and eroded protections to the point where it was Russian roulette. It was not a question of if, but a question of when and where. So it's also an important theme which Justin has, which is central to Justin's work, is regulatory capture. It's an important theme in my story. And it's also a story of the failure of the justice system. No one has been held accountable. 6 years after, no one in the industry, no one in government has been held accountable. So, let's see if I can work this. Maybe I can't work this. Talk into the mic? Okay. How come that's not working? Okay. I don't know if I did that or you did that. Okay. So that's the journey that the train took, starting in Newtown, North Dakota, back in shale. It went through Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, entered Canada at Windsor, up through on the top of the Great Lakes to Montreal, and and then to Lac-Me. On the way, it was headed for St. John, New Brunswick. There's a huge oil refinery run by the Irving Oil Company, which you probably haven't heard of, but it's a big refinery, and they okay, try again. That's the Irving Oil Refinery, and I didn't do that. But anyways, that was the destination, and they were buying back on oil because at the time they were getting oil from overseas, but it was very expensive in relation to Bakken, and so even with the extra transportation costs and so forth, it was cheaper for them to buy Bakken oil. And so they contracted Canadian Pacific. Canadian Pacific, at this time, it was, in 2012, it was a hedge fund in New York, owned by a guy named, hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman, that gained control of Canadian Pacific. And with a minority of shares, but with laser focused on getting share, they saw an opportunity to increase shareholder value big time with Canadian Pacific. And so he took control of the company, forced the existing board at the time and the CEO to resign, and put this guy in. Whoops, not that guy. This guy, Hunter Harrison, I'm sure is familiar to certainly the railroad workers that are here. He actually was first came to prominence as CEO of Canadian National, and he instituted his game plan, which was called precision railroading, or precision. Yeah, I use the shortcut, but you know what I'm talking about, precision railroading. But it's basically use fewer workers, run longer trains, run faster trains. What else? Longer, heavier, faster, and with really run roughshod over the workers. So he did that with Canadian National until he retired in 2009, and then retired, and then he was brought back by Bill Lac-Me to run Canadian Pacific and work his shareholder magic on Canadian Pacific. And so this guy is a guy named Ed Burkhart, and he was subcontracted by Canadian Pacific to take the cargo from just south of Montreal through Lac-Me into Maine and then up into New Brunswick and the Irving refinery. Now, he's sort of like a Hunter Harrison on a smaller scale. He at the time was 75 years old. He owned or was on boards of directors of railways companies in Europe and New Zealand, in the US as well as Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic. He also lives in Kenilworth, Chicago. I guess he's not far. So Fritz, he's still active, eh? He's getting close to 80, or maybe he's even a little more, and he's still active in the business. Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic, after the disaster, declared bankruptcy within a month. But he didn't pay any real penalty for no accountability for him. That's the train that took the cargo. The 10.5-hour trip to a place called Nantes, which is on a hill, about 11 kilometers. What's that? 6 miles away from Lac-Me. But Lac-Me is, as I said, is a small town in a basin, and so the slope from that where the train parked that night and to where it derailed is one of the steepest in Canada, including in the Rockies. So a real dangerous location. It was run by a single person, single operator, single person crew. He was the pioneer with single person crew. Ed Burkhart was. He was doing it south of the border in Maine. I understand he was doing it in Wisconsin at one time, or he tried to do it in Wisconsin until the Waiawaga accident, and I guess they stopped that. The regulators stopped that. But he was a pioneer with single-person crews, and he pushed hard to get. And that's a whole story. I don't know if I can tell that story tonight, but the effort to get him to, or get the regulator to give him permission to run single-person crews is a really important story, which I tell in the book. Regulatory capture, as Justin was talking about, those are kind of the elements of it. It's effectively self-regulation. It's government compromises its obligation, its first and foremost obligation for safety with the corporate interest in maximizing shareholder value. So it's an important story in this Lac-Me tragedy, and as Justin has said, and throughout the railroad industry, which is highly integrated in North America, which means the regulators are closely aligned as well, and there's lots of the lobby industry is very integrated as well. So it's not only the railroad industry. I've looked at it in the pharmaceutical industries, and we know what happened with Boeing recently. Just to step back a little bit, the oil boom's peaking in 2013. The industry's been real successful. The American petroleum industry and its Canadian counterpart are denying there's any problem with the volatility of the oil. That it doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be stabilized by before putting it into the tank cars. The government in Canada is run by a guy named Stephen Harper, who comes out of Alberta, and his goal was to make Canada an energy superpower, and they were willfully blind to the dangers. And then, of course, Irving bought it, and then, as I mentioned, they got permission to run with a single crew member. Try again. Okay, so that's what Lac-Me looked like on July 5th, and you can see how sharp that curve is. It is one of, as I said, one of the sharpest, the steepest and sharpest curves in the country. And so just a word about Tom Harding, who is the locomotive engineer. And yeah.
We have people watching the live feed, and they're saying that they can't hear that also.
Okay. I will try, and you keep advising me, Fritz, because I do kind of tend to move it away. One way of looking at it, I won't go into the Swiss cheese model of looking at risks and how they align, but if you look at it, if only the engineer could have parked it on the flat surface instead of on the top of the hill. But it was a long train. It was 1.7 kilometers. A long train. Couldn't park it on the siding because it was occupied, and anyways, it was in bad shape. But these long trains couldn't have parked on the siding. Anyways, he was prohibited from setting the air brakes on the tank cars itself. It was only on the locomotive air brake that they allowed him to set the air brakes, and then the lead locomotive was defective, and he noticed it, pretty much from the outset of the trip that should have taken 4.5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, took about 10, more than 10 hours. He was exhausted when he stopped the train for the night at about 11 o'clock at night. It caught fire shortly after he left. And the firefighters came, and they put the fire out, and in putting the fire out, they had to turn off the locomotive. So then the air brake started leaking out of the air, and that combined with the handbrakes that he had set, eventually, within about an hour, the train started to move. And there are other factors, I just mentioned those ones, but you can see those factors aligning. And the Swiss cheese model is like that. If you can imagine, those are blocks of Swiss cheese, and they just align in a straight line. You can go back quite a distance to see how they align. And he was at the last, the last link of the chain. One of the reasons I started doing this work was because very shortly after it happened, it was a blame game. And no one was taking any responsibility, but they were blaming the locomotive engineer. And I thought, this is crazy. I had studied these issues, policy issues, and I thought, I could do something that, I didn't have a vested interest. And so I started this work. And so that was the night, that was the apocalypse of July 6, 2013. That's the view from the church. The editor of the local newspapers called it the vomiting bowels of hell. That's how he described it. I have a chapter on that night and the days following, which it was a hard chapter to write. It's a hard chapter to talk about. It's a hard chapter to read, so I don't. But those are the numbers. That was a record spill, a land-based spill of back in 6 million liters is what, about 2 million gallons, something like that. So people who died, children orphaned, people committed suicide afterwards. You can see the magnitude of it, and it is the worst industrial disaster on Canadian soil since World War I and the Halifax explosion in the Halifax harbor. So that's an idea of what it looked like a couple of days after. Fritz, who is here, who just admonished me to get closer to the mic, I think we were both in Lac-Me for that remembrance ceremony. And those are I know their parents and their grandparents. It's one of the reasons I kept doing this work for them. And so, in the wake, cameras have gone away. You don't know as much about what happened in the town in the months and years afterward. It's been more than 6 years. More than half the population suffer from health, environmental, psychological traumas, PTSD. Soon after, the families residents were exploited by ambulance chasers. I tell the story of the ambulance chasers that came up from Texas and persuaded them to sign on to him to defend them because he said they could be better defended in U.S. courts, but he wasn't there to do that work. He just kind of signed off, got a finder's fee, $11 million, and passed it on. And disaster capitalists who persuaded municipal council, a lot of municipal council people, to just wipe the slate clean, creative destruction. And so they demolished a lot of buildings that didn't need to be demolished. But these are also stories of amazing courage of people that determined not to be crushed beneath the wheel and to keep fighting for justice for their community, for the safety of their community, and they really are, for me, I just said, they are heroes. They're heroes of mine, and they're still fighting. And it's still they managed to get. It hasn't been constructed yet, but the commitment from federal and provincial governments to build a bypass around the town, because what exists in the town now is just, it's still, they tore everything down, but nothing there has been rebuilt. There have been rebuilding in other parts of the town, but not there. And they have really, their pursuit of justice and rail safety, they're still pushing hard for a judicial inquiry, and they're getting a lot of support. They had a parliamentary petition. They had members of parliament that supported them. And I was on Parliament Hill for a press conference with them. And after the press conference, the transport minister called us, what did he call us? Conspiracy theorists. That's what he called us. What an insult to them. So, Justin knows this picture. That's that church, the same church that you saw from a different angle. That's what it was like just before, and that's what it's like pretty much still now. So I know my time is starting to draw near, and some of these I'm just going to go over very quickly or to skip. Sorry, they're on the PowerPoint, and if you want access to them, I'm sure through Jerry, you can get them. One thing that I want to point out is something that was introduced by the Harper government in 2012, which is the one-for-one rule. It means that in regulatory policy, not just rail, but all regulatory policy, if you're going to introduce a new regulation or propose a new regulation, an agency, you have to remove one. And they also had this what were called regulatory budgets. So you put a ceiling, and of course for the industry, everything about regulation is a cost. You know, it's a job-destroying, investment-destroying cost. And so you put a ceiling on regulations, on regulatory budget, and you gradually compress that ceiling. So it was a one-for-one rule. He got the idea from the British Prime Minister, who was doing the same thing. Of course, not to be overdone, but President Trump, in his promises during the campaign, promised a 3-for-1 rule. In effect, it's formally a 2-for-1 rule. So every proposed regulation, you have to remove 2. And you can imagine, as a regulator, you're stretched as it is, and you're having to make a Hobson's choice. Which is safer, the one I remove or the one I'm proposing? So it just puts them in a terrible, terrible quandary. And of course, President Trump is saying that, well, in reality, it's 15-1 or 20-1. So I don't know how that's playing out concretely, but Justin has given you a sense of what they've removed. And of course, and you imagine at the time where this oil by rail boom was happening, and that was the increase from 500 to 160,000 during this period in Canada. In the US, it was, I think, 9,000 to 415,000 by the time Lac-Me happened. And so they were, at the same time, they were cutting the rail safety budgets during all of this time. So, yeah, so aftermath, just a panic, with panic in both in the transportation departments in Canada and the U.S. In Canada, it was a real crisis of confidence that the public had demonstrated. It hadn't, they saw the consequences of the government not giving first and foremost priority to its safety obligations. I told you about the blame game. And the flurry of activity included immediate prohibition of single-person crews. Ironically, in the 3 months after July 6, the intensity of the lobbying effort by the railroad industry was the highest, most intense that it had been since 2010. So they really wanted to be in there ensuring that anything that happened, whether they were blocking, delaying, or diluting, or actually reversing, what was being proposed or what had been put into effect. So those are some of the improvements. I mentioned single-person crews. I have questions around all of the others, and Justin has talked about the tank cars and the new strengthened design, which ain't so strengthened. Insurance requirements, hardly enough, or speed restrictions, and all of those were put into place. And I have questions about all of them and where they are still. So where does the buck stop? 3 frontline workers charged. There was a trial. A jury acquitted the 3 workers. So you've got no one held accountable. Ironically, Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic, the defunct shell of a company, was also charged criminally, but none of its executives were charged. The owner wasn't charged. And so after the 3 men were acquitted, they said, oh, well, you know, we can't continue against the company. So we'll withdraw that plea. And in the wake of that, the Quebec legislature, a unanimous resolution saying, okay, you know, there needs to be an independent judicial inquiry. The Transportation Safety Board left a lot of unanswered questions. And as I continued to do this work, people came to me. And one of the about information behind the scenes, former, current people in the government. And one of the things I got was the original Transportation Safety Board report, which had 6 causes and contributing factors that were related to single-person crews. In the final report, they were all erased as cause and contributing factors. So you can understand why they need to keep pushing. And I've also explored the hierarchy of accountability, both within the bureaucracy and at the political level. I've alluded to the Prime Minister and certainly the relevant ministries and in the industry. So there is that accountability that just hasn't happened. And I think my list of risks that remain is very similar to Justin's. And so how safe is oil by rail? Well, they keep saying it's like mantra-like, rail safety is our #1 priority, whether it's the government or the industry. But we've seen an increase in train runaways, increase in accidents with trains carrying dangerous goods. Justin talked about Iowa and Manitoba. And so then they use it to argue for pipeline expansion because they're safer than dangerous rail. How amazing is that? These are the people that are responsible for ensuring that they are safe, and I view it as a false dichotomy. Safety for both railways and pipelines is paramount until a time when no oil is transported by pipeline or rail. So those are just a few little statistics that complement, or some of them repeat what Justin said. But just to notice in 2013 that it goes from 10% that imports from Canada constitute 10% of oil by rail traffic in the US, and that had increased to 43% by 2018. So basically, that's the conclusion. That's Justin's conclusion. I think that's the conclusion of others in this room. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is the tendency when the cameras go away and the time and distance to forget the causes, to forget who is responsible. And I just wanted to put that in a book that people could at least refer to. So the window is still open for history to repeat itself. So let's not forget Lac-Me. Thank you very much.
Bruce is a very sophisticated writer, and I really enjoyed reading his perspective of the Lac-Me Gantique rail disaster. And you know, we have the opportunity to learn from that. We've dodged 6 bullets in our local area already. One derailment right down the rail from where I live in Mundelein. I live in Hawthorne Woods. It derailed in Mundelein. There was another derailment, 2 derailments in Buffalo Grove. There were 2 derailments at the same location in Northbrook, where a bridge collapsed under the weight of one of these trains. And a couple was buried under there, and they were not found until the day after. Nobody knew they were even there. And then this last one in Lake Forest, and those were the DOT 111 cars. We've been blessed that we have not had one of these worst-case scenarios. The last person we have here is Jim Appleton. He was a first responder at the Oregon derailment. He was fire chief in Mosier, Oregon from 2009 through 2017. First on scene, he served as incident commander for the 2016 oil train derailment and fire in Mosier and local on-scene coordinator throughout the cleanup. Appleton offers key observations, lessons from firsthand experiences, the sum of which he states is that no one should have to go through what we did. Jim?
Thank you. It's great to be here tonight, and thanks to the sponsors and to Jerry in particular. A lot of very hard work. If you could go ahead and get that first slide up. Video guide, since there's people watching a stream, if you could give them a couple of minutes to look at this when I start speaking. A special thanks to the union representatives here and also Jerry's union. I'm really pleased to be part of that, and it's a good crowd. So I was the fire chief in Mosier. I want to make very clear that I'm no longer the fire chief, and what I say does not represent the fire district in Mosier. Want to say a few things about the community itself, looking at this picture. This is the morning after the derailment, about 4 hours after the fire was put out. And you can see the accordion cars there. It's a little hard to see any detail, but we'll take a closer look at some of that stuff. Basically, the second and third cars, the first and second of the accordion cars are the ones that were involved. The first car that was punctured is the second car, and that released oil onto the ground, which created a pool fire. It then impinged, meaning that it created openings in the first car through heat. That's valve seals, manway cover seals, and things like that. This is a unit train of Bakken oil. The cars were 1232 spec. And for those of you that are curious about all of that, that is a modified single-jacketed car that has a double jacket with insulation. We'll get a look at the actual puncture of the car in a few minutes. Saying a few words about Mosier, the fire district itself is 22 square miles around the city of Mosier. You can see the city of Mosier itself is fairly small. It's isolated from its neighbors. It's 14 miles to the next community to the east. We're looking east in this photo. It's 6 miles to the next community to the west. We're on the Columbia River. That's the river there. And the history of the town is amazing, and I'm not going to go into it for the purpose of time. But I do want to say it goes back thousands of years. I don't think anybody can tell when the first occupants settled there. And that's relevant because we'll see later on the tribes were represented in the organization that managed the cleanup. The other thing that's important as far as demographics and history is that Mosier is a bedroom community. There's essentially no local economy, no industries. We have one tiny market that is vibrant but limited, and the fact is that Mosier residents go elsewhere for their needs. The setup here is the white building with the green in front of it is the Mosier School. Just below that, yes. And just below that is a mobile home park, which is the closest major settlement. You can see some of those are quite close to where the actual fire was. That's the basic setup. I want to say a few words about myself. and then talk a little bit more about the timeline of the incident itself. And it's probably easier to say what I'm not. I'm not a rail safety expert. I'm not a hazmat technician. I'm not an expert on regulations. I'm just a local risk manager who happened to be on the job that day. And what I'm going to go through tonight is my inside perspective from somebody who had the fortune or misfortune to go through that experience. And I'm here to tell you about how my understanding of the issues around oil trains has evolved from that experience and continues to evolve. I want to make very clear, though, that I am not someone who thinks that oil is okay. I think these trains need to be banned, and I'm going to tell you why. And it may surprise a few of you to hear how I've come to some of those understandings. The main thing to think about this, and I want to repeat it early and often, is that Mosier was the first, and as far as I know, the only incident of an oil train where the decision was made to extinguish the fire. You saw a lot of spectacular fires that were not put out. And you saw a lot of instances where the threat was not from fire, but from toxic release. Where I will get to at the end of my talk is to say that maybe bomb trains is a bit of a misnomer. It's not to say that oil trains don't explode, but it's to say that the real hazard is the ridiculous accumulation of risk in one place. The idea that we haven't extinguished an oil fire, the reasons are two. One is that there's just too much energy released. There's no way that most of those fires could be extinguished. Castleton, no way. Nobody was going to touch that. The other thing, and this is something that I can't confirm, is that there have been decisions made to let the fire burn because that's the most expedient way to get rid of the oil. And those two points really highlight if there's too much energy to fight the fire, and if it's easier to let the oil burn, that really just says that there's too much risk there. So that's the main point. Explosion hazards, yes, but that's not the end of the picture. So here now I'm going to talk about the actual incident. And it's a little hard to see. These are those first two cars. It's probably better to see the one on the right. And if you can see, there's a circular piece down at the bottom. No, not that. Right there. Go up a little bit. That little circular piece. That's the bottom of the rail car where it attaches to the trucks, the wheel assembly. So we're looking at the bottom of that car. Those assemblies are made so that when the car derails, there's no physical attachment keeping them together, and so that the wheels and the car separate. The car in front of it, and I apologize for being a little bit hard to see, but that right there is the coupler from that car. So we're looking at the top, essentially, of that car, and that coupler gouged into the car behind it once they derailed, and you can see the black band running up to the left, and that's where the puncture was. It was fairly small. The coupler itself was still lodged in the hole, so the amount of oil that was spilling out wasn't very great. You can see the brown spot with the white around it. That's the part of the fire that got the hottest. That released oil onto the ground, and it created a pool fire. All in all, 47,000 gallons of oil were spilled. Of that, about 15,000 went into the ground. About another 20,000 is what actually burned over the course of about 12 hours. So that's not a huge fire compared to Lac-Me. And let me do an aside here and say that Mosier was not Lac-Me. We were a fairy tale in comparison. Or to use your analogy, we weren't a Swiss cheese incident. We were more like an Emmentaler or something that we were. It just didn't go there. Yeah. And it's kind of easier to talk about what didn't happen. And the question in my mind as I went through the incident was, why didn't it happen? Why didn't it get worse? A lot of people said, well, it just wasn't windy that day. And I was one of those people that thought initially that the fact that it wasn't windy, and Mosier is a very windy place, 24 hours before this, there were 35-mile-an-hour gusts from the west that would have blown that fire right into town. So I'll get to why why it wasn't worse as we go through this, but I want to underline that I still think it's important that, and Mosier is a case that demonstrates why it's important to ban the oil trains. So can we go back to the first slide? A couple of things about context. I have a bone to pick with the media because right away and up to the present day, there's references to this being near Mosier. It's not near Mosier, it's in Mosier. The city limits is a bridge that's right at the very bottom of the frame. Not that one, but right there. So this accident was entirely contained within the city of Mosier, and we were almost decimated, not by explosions, but by fire. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. The other thing that's not apparent here, and it's kind of hard to see because of resolution, is that the rest of the train, which has been removed, went out of the frame to the left, up to there, that's right. Where the cursor is right there, there's kind of a linear structure. Those are condominiums. And the night of the incident, we got a phone call from a woman who lived there who was just terrified that the oil cars in front of her house were going to explode. And we had no way of communicating with her until she got in touch with us. That was typical of this kind of an incident, but it's a sad story. And to think of that one person as representative, there's 1,000 stories like that in this picture, and you can imagine yourselves in this type of a situation, and especially the chaos of lack of communication, lack of understanding of what's really going on. And think of the people in the mobile home park there that were, they were really upset, I'll just say that. So to talk about the actual timeline of the event, this is Saturday morning. No, keep on that slide. This is Saturday morning. The fire's been put out. The train derailed about noon on Friday, June 3rd, 2016. It was coming from the east, so going towards the bottom of the photo, carrying crude oil from North Dakota to Tacoma. My understanding is that it was bound for export. I've been told otherwise, but I really don't know. I'm sticking with the export because at that time it made a lot of sense. The word was that the West Coast refineries weren't able to process the Bakken oil, so it had to go overseas. The actual track failure occurred kind of in the apex of the curve. There's a vehicle parked on the track. Jerry, if you can see right a little further, right there. That vehicle that's in the track is where the track actually failed. There were bolts, screws actually, that attached the rail to the ties. They had sheared below the level where they could be visually seen, and there were a line of them that failed like a zipper on the outside track of the rails. The rails came off the car there. They didn't actually derail until about a quarter mile further away. And we saw the tank rupture. The fire didn't start right away. There was a period, and I only know this because there are photographs of the derailment without fire. And people, I wasn't there, as I'll describe in a moment, right away. People said it was 5 to 10 minutes. Some people said 15 to 20. So I really don't know. My guess is that it was more like 5 to 10 based on my own experience. So the physical damage of this incident, and I'm going to carry this through to the present day, the spill area around the where the oil was released was fairly small, maybe about the size of this stage, maybe a little bit bigger. That's what was on fire initially and throughout the fire until it was extinguished. The wastewater plant, which is the building at just above right there. Those are the aeration tanks that Jerry's on right there. That system was affected because the point of release was about vertically, maybe 7 or 8 feet from the last manhole cover in the sewer line, the sewer main, from the town into the wastewater treatment plant. If anybody was doing the math when I said 15,000 gallons into the soil, 20,000 gallons out of 47, the remaining 10 went down that manhole cover through the main into the sewage treatment plant. By some miracle, the sewage plant was on a 90-day idle, so all of the expensive equipment was offline and valved so that the sewage just went straight through into the aeration ponds. Oil is lighter than water, and it was stored there. 10,000 gallons of oil that we didn't have to worry about. So that system then ends in the river. There was a tiny amount of oil, which we'll see in a minute, released into the river. It was deemed by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality not to be of consequence. It was on the order of an outboard motor, and you'll see from the picture that it's a fairly tiny amount. So if we could go through some of the other photos here. So that's the fire at about 3 o'clock, so 3 hours after the incident started. The white smoke is from the fir trees that are across the road from the oil fire itself, so that whole area was involved at that time. Let's take a look at the next one. This is about an hour earlier, and that's the size of the fire. You can see I said it, that the pool was about the size of this stage, and that's what's on fire. It was very, very hot. This was about as close as anybody could get. There were some people that drove through with cameras on that I don't want to bring up. So this was 3 hours after the incident. So jumping back in time, I said I was the first on scene, and I was, but I had gone into Hood River, the town 6 miles to the west, to have lunch. Not to have lunch, to order lunch to go to bring back. And that's not something that I usually did, but that day was windless, and in my view, it was safe to leave. So I ordered my lunch, and as I was waiting, my pager went off, and I looked at my phone. I couldn't hear what the actual call was on the pager. Looked at my phone. I didn't have my reading glasses on, and what I saw was blah, 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 big word, fire by overpass. So I thought, well, a day like today, how bad could it be? On my way in to lunch, I was thinking, gosh, I'm burnt out after years of doing this, and asking for help and not getting it from people who should have been helping me. And you know, what can possibly help me in this situation? Word to the wise: be careful what you ask for, because a train wreck is going to change your life. So I was driving back into Mosier from Hood River, saw the column of smoke, thought, well, I've seen car fires that are bigger than that. And the closer I got, the stranger it was. It's like, well, where is that? It's not on the freeway. It's not on the road. It's not Kathy Fitzpatrick's house. What is it? And I drove right by it, couldn't see because there's trees in the way. I later saw a video that if I had been really paying attention, I would have seen locomotives further up the line that were stopped. But, so I drove all the way into town, where the overpass crosses over the tracks, and I looked down and saw for the first time what we were dealing with, and I thought, oh Christ, a bomb. Pardon my... So, the rest of the talk tonight is going to be what happened to that bomb. And again, as someone who lived that from the inside, I have a pretty unique perspective on that I think I need to share with this community now. So the way that things unfolded from there was fire suppression. I'll zip through that and just say that it was a group effort. I'm not the guy that put it out. It was a team effort in which I played a fairly small part. We all made mistakes. I made mistakes which I took credit for. I was blamed for things that other people took credit for repeatedly, but I'm still kind of the guy that gets blamed for some things. Oh well. The important thing about the suppression effort is that very early on, we were crossing things off the list. It's like, gosh, this is almost easy. It's scary for sure, but very early on we made connection with a very good fellow from Union Pacific, a very brave hazmat responder who worked in Lac-Me and is no longer with Union Pacific, but I'm so glad that he was in Mosier that day. And within minutes of everyone assembling for the command structure, we were in touch with Jeff. We were sending him pictures. We had the train manifests. He knew what we were dealing with, and he said, guys, it's not going to explode. And I'll be there as quickly as I can. Given that the freeway was closed, it was kind of a challenge. To jump through a very complex story, it really was kind of easy to put the fire out. It's done by lobbing water onto the tank cars to cool them down. And when they no longer vaporize water, when the water's running off rather than turning into steam, less than 10 gallons of foam put out the pool fire that remained. That happened a little after 2 in the morning on Saturday morning. Correct. No. This is entirely because the Mosier fire could be put out. And I'll describe that in a minute. I want to jump ahead now to the resolution of how Union Pacific dealt with the community. And the three municipal governments, the City of Mosier, Mosier Fire District, and Mosier Community Schools, formed what's called an intergovernmental agency to settle with Union Pacific. They did an amazing job and wound up with a settlement. I can't give you the exact figures, but I think it was, I don't want to put out something that's wrong. But it basically made people whole. The school grumbled a little bit, and I know why. But that was an amazing event, and it's one of the things that I'm proud of as a Mosierite. I had little to do with the execution of it, although the concept of Team Mosier was something that I was pretty key in developing. It's one of the things that says why Mosier is such an amazing place. The fact that the resources were there in the community to do that, to do it well, and it's much to everyone's credit. Finally, a couple of ripple effects that occurred because of the Mosier incident. The most important of which, and I'm getting waved at, so I'm going to kind of gloss over. The oil terminal in Vancouver, BC, Washington, sorry, right across the river from Portland, was being considered during the time and afterwards. I testified at the request of the city attorney from Vancouver to the Washington State Energy Siting Facility Executive Committee, I think it is, the people that were to give a recommendation to the governor as to whether or not to permit the facility. I was told later by the city attorney of Vancouver that my testimony was one of the key things that shifted the commissioner's perspective to a recommendation to deny, which Governor Inslee finally did, in fact, deny the facility permits. And the points that I made to that committee were these, or the ones that got their attention. The real hazard from this incident was not from explosion. It was if there had been a windy day, as typical in Mosier that time of year, the timber that we saw on fire in that one aerial photo would have lit up, maybe not instantly, but it would have been very hard to prevent that from becoming a crown fire, meaning that the trees are on fire from bottom to top. That would have shot out burning embers downwind for a very long way and would have created a firestorm in the middle of the town and going as far as you could see in that photograph. And the chaos that would be going on out in those areas, people trying to leave, not knowing how to get around, burning debris across the road, power lines down, all of that is and P.S. We had plenty of resources, too many resources on June 3rd to fight just about anything. Had we had that wind-blown disaster, all of those resources that came in would have ignored the oil fire and would have gone out and tried to save lives. So that was something that the commissioners opened their eyes and said, wow, that's, even a best case scenario like Mosier could have turned deadly. And it would have gotten worse because nobody would have done anything to the oil fire for hours until Union Pacific got there. And when they did get there, they wouldn't have the resources to help them. So the thing that really got their attention was the comment that a month after the Mosier derailment, we had a structure fire call in Mosier. And at 3 in the morning on July 4th, and we called for mutual aid, meaning help from other departments, and nobody came. The reason for that is that there was a 300-acre fire bearing down on the center of town of the Dalles, the next town over to the east. And all of the people that had helped us on the oil fire were on that fire. It was their third or fourth major fire of the week. They were exhausted. Nobody got a full shift off. Everyone was tapped out. Finally, after we managed to save the house, we did get an engine of sleepy guys that showed up, thank goodness, and did play a key role, but they were not there in time to make much of a difference. When I mentioned that to the FSEC commissioners, that mutual aid is not a given, that it's dependent on the availability of the people that we call for. And we have an amazing mutual aid agreement that allows us to call from 5 counties in 2 states, and that failed that night. That got not only their eyes opening, but they looked at each other and went, and I know because I was watching them. So those are the 2 points to make about that. That yes, bomb trains are an issue, but other things are a real factor. Can we go back to this photo? And I'll close on this. There are other issues that I wanted to get into tonight, but I think I've made my main point pretty well. People might be thinking, that's an incredibly stupid thing for someone to do at a bomb train. They could have get blown up. But the person who took this photo is a man by the name of Richard Franklin, who lives in Portland. He works for the EPA. He was the EPA's lead person on this incident, and he was the person with the most authority to make decisions in what was later a 6-agency unified command on the cleanup. He was the incident commander for Hurricane Katrina, the incident commander for the Deepwater Horizons incident and cleanup, the incident commander for the Space Shuttle Columbia breakup over Texas, and a bunch of other ones. So this is not his first rodeo. And this is about 2 o'clock, so he was there about 2 hours after the derailment. He knew that there was no risk of explosion. And he's the one who decided that this would be suppressed because it was so close to population, and it was also worth going for because it was so small. So the idea of a bomb train, yes, there is risk of explosion, but oftentimes there's not, and the real threat is something else that may be more insidious. Some of those oil trains in water are going to, there was one with some multi-billion-dollar cleanup costs that these guys were talking. By the way, it's been great to have conversations with Bruce and Justin because we're learning from each other, and I think there's some very good connections being made. But to close, I think you get what I'm saying, that yes, and I'm not going to tell anybody not to use the term bomb train because I think it's a good rallying cry, but I no longer use it because I think this is a little more complex. I'll end it there. I think you get it.
We love the railroad industry. We think the railroad can be the green, safe future of transportation in the country, the things that have to be addressed. And there's a reason why the verb to be railroaded is understood in the English language. Everybody pretty much who speaks English knows what that means, and that's because of that history. So that's part of why we're out doing these things. I met Bruce for the first time in the town of Lac-Me when we were both there doing work in solidarity with the people, and as he said, it changed his life, it changed my life. But this is really not per se just the story about Lac-Me. It's an excellent thing to study because so many things came together, but the issues that are currently in making this industry a danger and high in risk for all of us are still going on 6 years after the wreck. So what we're going to do is, I guess people will raise their hands and Mark will give them the microphone, and so maybe you could say who you're addressing the question to, or if you want them all to respond.
And before, real quick, I just want to explain who Railroad Workers United is and what we are. We're an organization. We're a inter-union cross-craft caucus of rank-and-file labor activists. One of the problems for the rail unions and rail workers is we're divided by 13 different unions, and this is one way that they've played divide and conquer down to a science, to an art, and so we fight within to try to make our union stronger, to more effectively fight for issues like dignity on and off the job, and with that is safety. And Lac-Me is kind of became the poster child for what happens when everything goes wrong. And so we are trying to build alliances around these issues with the communities who, the bottom line is safety for us as rail workers. The community is also impacted. And so that's kind of the short version of where we fit into this picture. We need allies to fight for safety, and the community needs allies as well to wage the same fight. So on that note, I will take, okay.
Good. Hello, Brian Dupuy, letter carrier, union member myself. 2013 loss of life, 47 dead. Have any of the cases been adjudicated in courts, and what kind of settlements are being made?
I gather that's directed at me, and in terms of, I'm not sure I've fully heard your question. So you had the criminal trial, the acquittal. There were a number of there was civil lawsuit, class action, wrongful death. A number of defendants contributed to that settlement. In fact, most of them did, including the Canadian government, by the way, but the oil refineries. Anyways, a number of the one that didn't, and that was noticeable by its refusal to settle and is still fighting it in court, is Canadian Pacific. They're ragging the puck. They're just kind of running out the clock, whatever cliche you want to use. But they're refusing to settle, and they have the resources to do it. And so that's where the civil suits are at now.
Where's their corporate headquarters?
Canadian Pacific in Calgary.
Thank you.
And I actually don't know. Maybe the railway, someone in amongst the workers knows actually who's in control. At the time of Lac-Me, it was Bill Ackman, the hedge fund in New York, the shareholder, and his guy was Hunter Harrison. He sold off his share in 2016. It's not clear to me who has controlling interest. You can have controlling interest with a very relatively small number of shares, especially if it's diversified ownership. Bill Gates, with a fairly small share, pretty much controls Canadian National.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. I know you talked a lot about oil, Vulcan oil and oil tank cars, but we understand there's like 72 hazardous materials transported by these freight trains, and things like ethanol, cargo like ethanol, molten sulfur, chloride, propane, all the other chemicals that are actually more explosive and perhaps more hazardous if there were a train wreck. How do we deal with safety relative to those issues? And also, how do we persuade our elected officials that this is a matter of safety, public safety, that we have trains running so close through our communities that really the railroad shouldn't have as much influence as the public safety should have.
Yeah, I think you're definitely correct. There are other materials that are being moved through these communities that could cause even worse disasters. One of the reasons that doesn't happen as often is they're not, in 100-car trains of unit trains. So that is the reason we see with ethanol and oil, we see these incidents happening more often. But yeah, how do I, unfortunately there's a quote that I first came across in a document from 1901, and it's that the railroad rules are written in blood. And that's a quote that I read again in 2016 after an Amtrak crash. And what that means is nothing happens until enough people die. And unfortunately, you would think 47 people dying in Lac-Me would have had a major impact. As we've explained, it has not. And so I think that pressuring, educating our elected officials, one of the things having talked about this for 6 years now, there's a low level of awareness. People like yourselves are showing up and learning about this and are interested and know about it. It's really, I talk to a lot of people in big cities where these trains are going through, and they're just not aware of the risk. So I think it is an issue of raising awareness, but also, I write a lot about it in the book, but the power that Congress has over all this process. They can make regulations. They can repeal regulations. Pressuring and educating and pressuring our representatives is, I think, the first place to start. And I don't think a lot of congressional representatives are aware of these issues. I think a lot of people think because there hasn't been a major incident in the last year that it's been fixed. That the new tank cars have made everything safe. So I think it's the hard work of really educating people, raising awareness, and putting pressure on elected officials. If they're not going to do something, find a better one and vote them out.
Before I call on the next person, I just want to weigh in real quickly on the issue of safety. You all touched upon it, and I started railroading in 1974, and fortunately I got out alive a few years ago. But I witnessed I lived through it, the decline in safety, the attacks, and this does not have to happen. Railroads can be run safely with shorter trains, more rested, non-fatigued crews, more crew members. So they don't have to happen. It's a question of our will, exercising our will and our power to demand what we're entitled to as workers, a safe workplace, a safe and dignified workplace, and as community to not have to live in fear of being the next tragic accident. So, okay, and I sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I'm not missing anybody else.
A very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Just a clarification. The Lac-Me train derailment started in Canada, came to the train started in Canada, came to Milwaukee, came down through Chicago.
It started in North Dakota.
In North Dakota. Oh, it started in North Dakota. Okay, yeah. So that. No, right, exactly. I thought it started in Canada, and I was wondering why would it dip down in the U.S. and then. Okay, very good. Thank you.
But the part of the explanation for the routes that it was taking, that train was actually going to go back into Maine before it went to arrived at the refinery back in Canada. They were moving so much of this oil that they were doing. I mean, I was in Albany, New York. That refinery in Canada, they were sending trains to Albany, New York, unloading them onto boats, sending them down the Hudson River, and then back up to that refinery in New Brunswick. So it was just an effort of any which way they could get that oil. And safety was not obviously the top concern.
And Canadian Pacific, that was the contractor, actually had a choice. And it's just, again, the question of profit over safety. The reputation of Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic was well known. It was a delinquent railway company. They could have partnered with Canadian National, which had a much better safety record and gone a different route, but it would have been less profitable for CP to have partnered with CN. They could have arrived at the same destination, but the advantage was really to go with this delinquent railway. So again, it's the safety compromised for the bottom line.
I'd like to ask about the situation with insurance. Are the railroad companies self-insured, or do they have to buy policies where they assess the risk?
I think I'm not an expert on an issue, but the insurance for these incidents are, I think in Lac-Me it was $25 million of insurance. The tab for that now is up over $1 billion. So they're operating with nowhere near enough insurance. And even now, when they do worst case scenarios, the railroads, when their worst case scenarios, you would think Lac-Me would be the starting point for a worst case scenario. They're able to say, oh, we're going to spill a fraction of what happened in Lac-Me. So that's another place where the system is completely broken, and the people who are paying, taxpayers and Canadian citizens are paying for what's going on in the cleanup. And again, Lac-Me has not been rebuilt, and there's not insurance money to rebuild it. So that's a huge issue, and it's another thing that the railroads get away with.
Well, I'd like to point out,
environmental liability insurance, and we should be pressuring the railways to finance that rather than us.
it seems like common sense. If you can't insure it, well, why is it out there on the rails in this case?
Yeah, I would agree in Canada as well. There have been some improvements in insurance, but they're nowhere near what's necessary. The company that's running that, what was formerly Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, has $75 million of insurance. So it's not running unit trains yet, and it probably won't until they get the bypass done, but they will do it again for sure.
Thanks everyone for this presentation. I'm Kathleen Rood with the Nuclear Energy Information Service, and for all of us here who are concerned about the safety of our railways and what we're shipping on there, I want to add into this conversation that another thing that they're talking about moving on train lines is high-level radioactive waste that is being produced at our nuclear power plants all across the country. And here in Illinois, we have the most nuclear reactors of any state. In the country, we have 80,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste throughout the country. And so they're talking about trying to move some of this waste to temporary storage. We don't have permanent storage for it. And the railways is one of the ways that they're talking about moving it. And these shipments, even when they're packaged up, just sitting on the rail cars, they are emitting some level of radioactivity, so they don't have to blow up or break to cause damage to the rail workers. So we're really concerned about that. And then if we can imagine an accident where we've dumped oil, imagine if that's high-level radioactive waste. We have a real catastrophe on our hands. So we're looking to collaborate with all of you working with concern for the oil trains and bring our awareness as well to high-level radioactive waste and making sure that we keep it off the train lines. And also, they're talking about putting it on barges and taking it across the Great Lakes as well. So I'm interested if any of you folks who've been writing about this and covering issues have been aware of the concern with high-level radioactive waste and also with the train workers as well. Thank you.
I just want to touch upon that real quickly. As a rail worker, we don't know about the nuclear stuff because they hide behind national security. So normally we know if we have ammonia. Normally we know if we have chlorine. You know, but that we don't even know that we're carrying nuclear cargo because it's hidden with national security.
Mark, there's one up here, right?
Okay.
She was first, right?
Okay. Okay. I'll get it. Tell me who's next.
Right here, Mark.
It seems to me this is the second time I've been at one of these, and like Brian, I'm a letter carrier. I'm a federal employee. As a union member, the fact that you have 13 unions complicates things, and I imagine your membership is very low because you have so few people on the cars. But it seems to me the biggest problem here is public awareness. If everybody in Deerfield knew how many trains were coming through with this stuff, they'd be having a fit. Have they ever considered, or maybe you're prohibited from having a strike, but it seems to me a work stoppage would bring a lot of attention to the issue and would open up the media to exploring if you went on strike because of the safety issue? Or would they just sidestep it by turning it over to one of the other railroad companies? I'm not sure, but it seems to me, it's just like right now. I read something the other day, the United Auto Workers are on strike. The Teamsters have stopped delivering vehicles they're not going to transport anything until that strike is over. So other unions get involved. It's raising the public awareness, and that's what you need is the public support.
The quick answer to that is called the Railway Labor Act, and we can only strike on what is a major dispute after years and years of negotiations and mediation and cooling off periods, and then the rare occasions when it finally gets to that point, then we get a presidential emergency board, and Congress writes our contract. The board recommends a contract. Congress passes it, and we're ordered back to work. So those are issues that I personally, I have always advocated that rail workers need to question the moral and ethical legitimacy of them taking that right to withhold our labor. But that's an issue that as rail workers we have to work through. A very good point and very good question. Canada has different laws, and I'm not equipped to speak on those, but okay, who was next? Okay. Thanks for bailing me out. Sorry about that.
Is there some way for the public to know when and where these trains are going? Because I think if the people know that trains with 100 cars of oil is coming through their town, they might do something about it. Is there some way for people to know?
Unfortunately, that's something where the railroads have said that, well, initially they said it was a national security or a security issue. They will not release it to the public. They do release information to first responders, but Jim can say it's not very detailed. So as the public, really the only way for you to know is, and people do this in various communities, is to go out and spend 24 hours on the train tracks and watch trains come by, and you can tell what's an oil train by the placard on the side. But it's something that, it's another thing that the rail companies are very good at saying, we'll refuse to give you this information because it's a national security issue, or there are other explanations. But it isn't, as far as I know, there's nowhere that the public has a good understanding of how much oil is coming through, when it's coming through, unless they're personally seeing the trains come through. It's a red square.
Were you done, by the way? Yeah, as long as. All right, cool. Then I'm just going to take my turn, if that's okay. This makes a good segue, because I was actually going to hijack the mic. I'm sorry? Okay, so I want to actually supplement some of the questions that have been asked, and also some of what our presenters have said. Okay. So I'm Sarah Zarling. I'm with the organization Citizens Acting for Rail Safety in Watertown, Wisconsin. I've been an oil train activist since November of 2015, or February of 2015. And in November of 2015, an oil train actually did derail in my community near my home. It didn't explode, which is a miracle. The cause of derailment was broken rail, and Canadian Pacific had just been out to the track to inspect it just days before in the same spot where the derailment happened. So even though we already know that there's not enough inspectors for the amount of tracks, but even when the inspectors come out, it doesn't matter because things can still go wrong. Okay, how do we as community members band together to stop this? So first of all, you have to know what you're looking for. So this is the placard right here. This is just an example. So 1267 is typically the Bakken and tar sands, and then 1987 is ethanol. So these are a couple of the numbers that you can look for to know what is coming through your community on these unit trains. 1075 is propane. My friends in Milwaukee are dealing with that quite a bit. So you can report, actually, you can be a citizen oil train spotter. So to do that, the best way is if you have Twitter, but hashtags can carry. So what you need is the hashtag, the abbreviation for the state that you live in, and then Oil Train Watch. So when I report on oil trains, I use the abbreviation Wisconsin Oil Train Watch, but you would use Illinois Oil Train Watch. So what you do is you note the time, the date, the direction, and the location, exact location. And that is how something like the blast zone map, that's so you can go to, I think, blastzone.org, is that it? Yep. Just Google oil train blast zone map, and it'll come up. And you can search where you live, and then it will tell you if you live in a blast zone. And that's from the track to a half a mile away. And so the only reason why those maps exist is because of citizens doing the on-the-ground reporting themselves, because, yes, the rail industry feels like we don't have a right to know what's coming through our communities. So, Bruce, I'm really sorry that I have to do this. But I'm going to go ahead and finish what Bruce was getting at. So the slide that he could not bring himself to talk about, this is the mother Talita. She was 30. And these are her daughters, Alyssa and Bianca. They were 4 and 9. They were burned alive in their home while they slept when the train exploded in Lac-Me. One thing that's not talked about nearly enough is that the nature of these explosions, the way that it killed everybody, they had to be found by their remains. So I want you to just think about this and let this soak into your head. So people were either out at a bar, like having fun, or they were at home sleeping in their beds, and their bodies were incinerated, and they had to be discovered by their remains. And some of their remains were never found, and Bianca's is one of those. So not only did families never get closure and never be able to say goodbye to their loved ones, but some of them, their loved ones' remains were never found, so they never got that full closure. I also want to mention another victim. Jerry, you're a teacher, yes? So Bruce mentioned that everybody in the town of Lac-Me, it was a small community and everybody knew each other. One of the people who died in the accident was a 28-year-old high school teacher named Mathieu Pelletier. This was his 4-year-old son that he left behind. So I want you to think about, like, for Jerry, for example. So an oil train derails and explodes and decimates your town, but then your high school teacher is one of the ones who dies. So I just imagine what it would be like if something like that happened to Jerry, and the children in that school had to deal with that on top of what had already happened in their community. So this is a very personal and very real thing that you really should get involved in and try and educate your neighbors as much as possible.
Every night I go to bed, I pray
Yeah. Yes.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about the cars themselves. Why is it that we don't have the development of, or the engineering of cars that are self-sealing or more structurally sound or have skins that are impervious to various parts of explosions or some sort of encounter with another vehicle or whatnot? Is that so difficult, and who pays or who manufactures these particular cars?
No, it's certainly not impossible to engineer a rail car that could survive the speeds that these trains are. But the problem is that rail car would be heavier, and there's a total. So the heavier the rail car is, the less oil you can put in it, because there's a total limit, the combined weight of the empty rail car plus what it's carrying. The rail industry, actually, when this first came up in the discussions before the new regulations, the rail industry executives were saying, we think this oil should be in what's called a pressure car. It's a much stronger car because it's so volatile, it's more like a gas than a liquid. Liquid propane, LPG, is moved in these pressure cars. They're much stronger, they would not rupture in the same way. It's purely, again, a case of that idea of using pressure cars for oil quickly got shot down. One of the main reasons is the cars are owned by the oil industry. The railroads don't, for the most part, do not own the cars. They're either leased or owned, leased from big banks who own a lot of them, or they're actually owned by the oil companies. And the American Petroleum Institute, throughout the whole regulatory process, they were always at the table, and they always had the first seat at the table, and they drive this whole conversation. So, you know, I may have said it earlier, I think you could move Bakken crude oil safely by rail, but it would cut into they couldn't make a profit. So you would have to stabilize it, you would have to, and then stronger cars, modern brakes, and there are other things. It's not an unsolvable engineering problem by any way. It's an economic problem, and the lobbyists are the ones calling the shots.
You just add from the trial of in Lac-Me itself, which was a rich source of information that otherwise would never have come out because we haven't had that judicial inquiry. Because of the self-regulation, these cars that were used that had they were supposedly qualified to withstand a wreck up to 15 miles an hour as long as the weight was not above a certain limit. But the only people responsible for looking at that were the railroads themselves. And some of the testimony that came out was that in the industry, the people loading the cars would say, fill it to the weight limit, and realize that there was a whole volume left in the car because it was so heavy. And they're like, we're not going to send this out there half empty. So they went ahead and filled it up, an additional measure further. And this is one of the things that came out in the trial. So even if it had been held to the limits that it was supposed to be, it still would have wrecked in that situation. But it's a worse situation than that.
Okay, next. All right, and see you.
Hi, a comment and a question. First, my town of Glenview managed to stop the holding track proposal after a fair amount of money that the actual town of Glenview had to pay separately to convince not to have a holding track. If you're familiar with that phrase? Are you folks in the panel, are you familiar with the phrase the holding track proposal? I don't see a nod or a shake. Is that a yes?
That specific proposal?
Yes. Well, it's not the Amtrak Hiawatha. That was a misnomer. That was a dog and pony show title. It had nothing to do with Amtrak Hiawatha. They wanted to build a sidetrack. They called it the holding track. Anyway, the thing is that the town of Glenview had to stop it by paying thousands of dollars to their own lobbyists in order to get them to stop the idea of putting a mile-long train sitting next to downtown Glenview. But Glenview had to pay for it. But the question I want to ask you is that from what I understand, there is something in the different types of oil that comes out of our Midwest that is different than the Bakken oil. Does that sound familiar to anybody?
Certainly, I mean, the Bakken oil, and we refer to it as the Bakken oil. Every well of crude oil is different. So across North Dakota and Montana and the Bakken, you can see great variations in what's coming out of the ground. And as these shale fields that they're fracking get older, what's happening right now in the Bakken is there a lot more gases coming out with the oil. So oil produced here could be very different. Like I said earlier, crude oil doesn't explode. So if you're actually if what they're producing from a more conventional well was just traditional crude oil, it is very different from the Bakken oil. So it does the characteristics of the oil are very dependent on where it's produced and how it's produced.
And also, just one other question is that have you been contacting the people who are creating the 2050 centralized terminal in the south side of Chicago near 75th Street?
No, I'm not involved in specific local issues in this area, so that I'm not up to speed on those.
Thank you.
I just want to add one comment. You're referring to the holding track. We actually, any of us in the railroad industry, I'm a subcontractor for a small railroad in Franklin Park. We actually call it a siding. So it's a shorter track, and then it's got a switch to go back into the main. So you're saying holding track, we know it as a switching or as a siding track. Thank you.
All right, I'm getting the word that we're going to have to wrap up. One or two more? All right, okay.
Yeah, hi, thanks for coming. My name is Mark Lundholm. I'm the climate change lead with the Northwest Suburban Organizing for Action Group. I retired from working in the environmental industry on several emergency responses, so I know about some of this stuff. But what I wanted to ask you, do you have an action plan? Recommendations for what we need to do?
Yeah, well, I think it is very difficult, but it starts with politics and really influencing on a local level. As I mentioned earlier about the activism, people have been very successful organizing on a local level to stop new oil train infrastructure, and in cities like Portland, Oregon, they've gone as far as to put a ban on any new infrastructure for oil. And so there are, I believe those are actions that can be taken by local communities. One of the unfortunate things about organizing about an issue involving the railroad industry is there isn't much you can do if the railroad just passes through your community because of the federal preemption rules. So the real successes in activism have been where the oil is loaded or unloaded, blocking it there. But I do think that the thing that everyone needs to do is really educating our congressional representatives on these issues and making them act, because that's how this is going to happen. The issue that's going to be fought in the courts now about the volatility of oil that because of the rule in Washington State, that probably now is, depending on the court decision, there should be a federal regulation for that to limit the volatility of the oil. There is one proposed. It was proposed at the end of the Obama administration because the New York Attorney General petitioned them to have a rule. I fully expect it will be repealed during the Trump administration, and they will say the same thing. As part of this Washington State argument, they will say that preempts the Washington State. So I expect that to happen in the next year. But aside from blocking new infrastructure, I think it's really about educating people. I mean, we've heard other people out here talking about raising the awareness. More people need to know about this risk, and then really pressuring our politicians, and if they won't do anything about it, working to remove them.
So we need to wrap. So I just want to say one thing real quickly. The bomb trains and Lac-Me has obviously been the catalyst for all of this. But even if oil bomb trains were ended tomorrow, These trains run through the community with ammonia, with chlorine, and I have always lived in fear of an ammonia car or chlorine opening up in a heavily populated area. So it's about rail safety and our will to have a say on that. We ask you to sign. We have a sign-up sheet so that you can get more information from us, from Railroad Workers United, from Jerry's, from the other organizations. So please do the sign-up sheet. We have Justin's books here, and we can get. I had a shipment problem, wasn't able to get enough of Bruce's books, but we can work something out where if you buy them from our website or here, we'll ship them to Bruce and have them sign them, so you'll eventually get a signed copy. Sarah wants one.
Okay. Sorry, this is very important. Jim, this question is for you. The children were attending Mosier School at the time of the derailment, yes? And they needed to be evacuated from the school?
Yes.
Yes. So let's think about that too, friends.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for your time.
And just so everyone knows, the National Organization of the Owners of the Railroads have announced formally through the Railway Labor Act that this year's bargaining for the whole U.S. rail industry is going to include their attempt to force the issue of single-person crews, which for many of us was the single most universal problem that was highlighted by the Lac-Me incident. So they've learned nothing. They're going to go forward with this. They're aggressive, so you have to be vigilant.